and say very welcome to all of you to the DCAP academic program, the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at the University of Cape Town. And it's lovely for us to have today with us Professor Astrid Berg, who many of you will know is an Emerita Professor of the University of Cape Town. Astrid had the joy of retiring a few years ago, and she's been more busy than ever before. In fact, particularly on all sorts of really interesting research in the last number of years around infant mental health and interventions for infant mental health. So Astrid, it's lovely that you agreed to come and talk to us today about intergenerational transmission of trauma and racism, and thinking about that vicious cycle that we may have. So I'm very happy to just hand straight over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Petrus, and good morning to everybody. I really am sorry I can't be with you and discuss with you, because many of the things are very complex, and it would be good to have all our minds put together. But let me go ahead and see what we can do in this situation. So I'm just briefly going to look at the origins of seeing the other, then look at trauma and how that inhibits reflective functioning, as well as racial stereotyping. I briefly want to touch on two papers that describe the neuroscience of in-group bias. And then the last bit, which is really the sort of most important, most difficult, is thinking about how to enable a reflective capacity in our children. So to go back to Daniel Stern, we always seem to revert back to him. He was a researcher and a psychoanalyst, and the first person to really put the development of the self in the center of a theoretical model. And he said there can be no self without an other. So how we experience ourselves in relation to others provides a basic organizing perspective for all interpersonal events. Damasio, who doesn't talk so much from an infant point of view, but more about the beginning of consciousness, says when an outside object causes the organism to react and thereby change its state, that is when we become conscious. So that the sense of self in the act of knowing an object, then the self, you understand, becomes bigger. The self has a part of that object, knowing that object in him or herself, and new knowledge. And that is how the self develops and evolves. So there can be no sense of self without the sense of an other. Now, Beatrice Beebe, in her research in New York, has done this amazing work, microanalysis, and puts a camera on the baby, as you can see here, and a camera on the mother, and then they match the two and analyze second by split second who does what first and how does it look. And I'm just got one thing here, like a sequence of infant positive effect. And here you see in great detail how every split second is analyzed, mouth open, mouth wide, and how the affect intensity goes from low to high, and how it's very important to note here that the infant's head is moving slightly up. And then they match that with the mother's. Okay, so we don't need to go into this, but I wanted to give you the idea of the precision with which the interaction has been recorded and then coded. So what she came to is that in time, the infant expects the mother to react in a certain way. That's why the internal coherence of the mother or parent is so important, so that we form temporal, spatial, affective, anticipatory expectancies of the other person's behavior. So we expect another person to act and move their face, move their hands in a certain way. And this is called action dialogue. And this is the most primitive, the unconscious part of what we respond to. It's completely out of awareness. What this mother is doing with the baby, she's not aware of. And if we weren't able to slow down the videos like Petrus de Vries' team does, we wouldn't be able to see any of this. But what I wanted to point out is, so we go from action dialogue to the more aware, the more cognitive process of mentalization. And mentalization was a term coined by Fonagy and Mary Target, is the ability to attribute mental states and beliefs to others. And Fonagy contends that our large social groupings require of us the ability to read the minds of the other. And that's why we have large forebrains. It's called the social brain hypothesis. Because in order to survive, we need to outsmart the other and try to read their motives and imbue their behavior with meaning. So if we can look at this imagined drawing of our ancestors of this group. So the one sitting underneath in the cave here, that would be like the in group. We'll get to that term just now. And the ones coming here might be the out group. So these people will have to wonder, are these people friendly? Are they going to attack us? What do they want? What's on their minds? So that's why our forebrains developed in this way, that we can try to read their minds so that we can be prepared for what comes. Of course, we can never completely know what's in their minds, but we can approximate and by their actions see whether the hypotheses we form are correct or not. So some words about some definitions. So as I said, mentalization is the human capacity to make meaning of one's own and others' behavior through understanding the states of mind that underlie that behavior. So if these previous people were friendly, then they won't harm us. But if they are baring their teeth and they look angry, then we might be more on guard. Reflective functioning is much the same. It's more the overt manifestation of mentalization, but it has also become a term, a research term, which operationalizes mentalization, and particularly mentalization where it comes to the parent-infant or parent-child interaction. Because I think you can see that nowhere else in the human development is it so necessary for the one person, the parent, to be able to try and think what the nonverbal infant, what's going on for the nonverbal infants and read their minds. So that's part of the normal development. So it includes self and other. You can mentalize just about yourself, or you can mentalize just about the other, but that connection between the two, self and other, is reflective functioning. Why am I behaving in this way? What does my behavior do to the other? And how is the others responding, and how might the other feel? That is really reflective functioning. So it's for me more interactive than just the term mentalization. And reflective practice is a sort of newer word, and it has taken this whole reflective approach onto another level of not just working with patients, but in supervisory relationships, in organizations and in communities. And there's a very nice paper on reflective practice in the bigger world by Joshua Sparrow in an infant mental health journal. I can give you the reference. So what about our collective context? We need to reflect on two broad matters. in our country on trauma and on racism, which, if we remain unconscious of these, will be transmitted to the next generation, as we are seeing. But before going there, let me just link for you attachment, trauma, and mentalization. So look at this idealized picture of a cottage by the sea. You have a mother with her youngest little girl and her older girl. And it's obvious that it's a peaceful setting. This little child trusts her mother. So secure attachment means absolute trust. And therefore, this little one doesn't have to think about, am I safe, am I not safe? She knows. She knows she's okay with her mother. So her mother then can help her think about what her older sister might want. So it's the practice ground to acquire mentalization. So she may say, look, that's your older sister. She wants to play with you. She's wondering what you are doing, etc., etc. So the mother in the secure attachment can help this child to understand the mind of her older sister. So, and then in turn, when this child becomes a mother, she can do the same for her child. So it goes on. So secure attachment is the practice ground for learning about the minds of others. Now, what happens if there's trauma? How different are these situations? This mother can't say to her two children, oh, look, I wonder what's happening there. All she has to do is fight for survival. And the children cling to her, and it is a question of physical survival, as with this mother who can't say to her daughter, oh, I wonder what daddy's trying to do, or what's going on in daddy's mind. There's no ways you can mentalize in these situations. So to recap, a secure attachment enables exploration of the world, physical exploration of the world, as well as exploring the mind of self and others. Trauma activates anxious attachment, as we've seen in those last pictures, and therefore inhibits exploration, and therefore inhibits mentalization. And if we look at how this works, is we have the trauma in infancy, we have fear and panic, the attachment system is hyperactivated, they cling to each other, there's no space for reflective functioning, and this experience remains unmetabolized, split off, and is destined to be repeated, or anything similar to that experience will evoke the same fear and trauma in the person. So that is the link and the sort of transmission. So to talk a bit about parental reflective functioning, the parent's capacity to understand the nature and functioning of his or her own, as well as the child's mental state, that creates this experience of safety and comfort. Now, Emerita Slade did a very nice study in 2005 already, whereby she took, I think it was 14 pregnant women, and in the pregnancy did an adult attachment interview on them. So that's where they talk about their experiences of childhood. And then at 10 months did a reflective functioning coding with them, parental reflective functioning. And at 14 months did a strange situation, which measures attachment. And what she found is that there's a significant relationship between adult attachment and parental reflective functioning at 10 months post-birth, and significant relationship between parental reflective functioning and the infant attachment at 14 months. And therefore the conclusion was that parental reflective functioning plays a crucial role in the intergenerational transmission of attachment. So this means that the mother, I'm saying here mother because that's what her study was about. The mother who is able to reflect on her childhood, even though she may have had trauma, but is able to reflect on it and talk about it in a measured way, not dismissive, not avoidant, not over-involved, but in a sort of, yes, my father beat my mother, and it was awful for us, but I now can see why, and or has some explanation so that it's kind of settled in her mind. Even if there's trauma, it's settled in her mind. That mother will be able to reflect on her child, on her baby at 10 months, on her baby's behavior. And that baby will have a secure attachment at 14 months, as measured at 14 months. So what's crucial isn't so much that you must have a mother who's had a perfect childhood and everything will be fine. You need a parent who's able to reflect on their own inner child, their own past experiences, and have worked them through, and then it won't be transmitted. And it's come out in other studies as well, not just this one. So historical trauma, by definition, is a mass trauma inflicted upon a target population. It continues over an extended period. It reverberates throughout the population, and it derails the population from its natural projected historical course. The negative effects being transmitted to the next generation. So let's just look at racism. There's a lot that we could look at and could go into more depths as about sort of racism, colonial racism, racism in South Africa, where it started. And you can see this painting is an old one, 1634, probably the Dutch East India Company. And I just think it just portrays so perfectly the inequities, the fears, the arrogance, subservience. And what is interesting, there's an almond hedge in Kirstenbosch. And the story about that is that the first settlers in the Cape of Good Hope in 1652 set up a refreshment station for passing ships. And this settlement happened to lie in the path of the indigenous Khoi grazing routes. And conflict broke out between them a few years later. And Jan van Riebeeck then decided to create a defensive barrier between the settlement and the path of the Khoi and cattle. This was the first wall of apartheid and is now being kept at Kirstenbosch Garden to remind us. And I can't help but to bring in this quote from Credo Mutwa, who is a very respected traditional healer and who died at the ripe age of 90-something this year. And he said this in 82, but a few white people have ever bothered to study the African people carefully. And by this, I do not mean driving around the African villages, taking photographs of dancing tribesmen and women and asking a few questions, and then going back and writing a book, a useless book full of errors, wrong impressions, and just plain nonsense. And if we read of some of the books of those times, that is indeed so. Credo Mutwa himself studied English literature and read English books, just about every important English book he had read. So he didn't do that with the English culture, but we can't say the same the other way around of those times. I want to just mention two studies, neuroscience studies. This one is a review, and I'm not going to go into it other than to say that the neural activation across the brain is such that we divide the world into us versus them. So it's very deep. It's midbrain level, the amygdala. So if we see something or somebody that doesn't fit, or we can't read, we don't know, it divides us. It divides our thinking. That's them over there. And at the end of this paper, Molenbeek says that biases and perceptions and emotions, having said that they are natural, that they are deeply embedded, they're deeply ingrained in our actual brains, but they can be modulated by executive cognitive control. We don't just have a midbrain with amygdala, we also have a forebrain that can exercise control over these implicit biases. And that the more people can become aware of the implicit racial bias, the more they will be able to regulate them. And that neuroplasticity still exists to a large degree in adults, so that cultural and developmental differences can still be modulated by new experiences and recategorization. So it's not hopeless. It is in us, and we need to recognize it, that we all have racial biases. It's a natural thing, but it's an opus contra naturam. It goes against, we have to work against our nature to overcome these biases. Then the other one is the Italian study, which is more specific, is not a review, whereby they asked a group of white students to look at photographs of a black face having painful stimulus, like I think it's a needle, or a non-painful stimulus with a cotton bud, black faces and white faces. The people who watched were white students. They were the subjects. And then they measured them through on an EEG, on the ERPs. And you can see here that when the white students watched white faces, they responded to the pain. It was almost like they were experiencing the pain. Whereas when they watched the black faces, there was no difference between pain or no pain. I mean, that's hectic. And these ERPs are instantaneous responses. They can't be controlled cognitively. They're too quick. They on that deep level. So how is it with infant development? By 3 months of age, infants prefer to look at faces of their own race. At birth, infants prefer to look at configurations that are like the face, 2 dots and a line. They prefer that schema. By 3 months, they prefer to look at faces of their own race. However, if exposed to another race, there will be no visual preference for either group. So if the infant has mixed ancestry, has a white mother and a black father, or a white mother and a black nanny, there will be no visual preference for either group because the infant will be familiar with both. Children, then a little bit later, children construct their own beliefs from the information around them. They need to be taught that race is a social category. If we don't say it, if we don't give unconscious messages, they won't And if society doesn't, they wouldn't necessarily know that race is a social category, something that's socially important. They would notice differences, but they wouldn't put value on them. But because they are embedded in a social group and in their families, they develop an in-group bias. And as I said, that's part of our evolutionary heritage and of our survival. So what is the source of bias for infants? It's in the language and in the behavior of adults. And if we just cast our mind back to the Beatrice-Bibi interactions and how infants notice slight differences, they will know. You cannot fool a young child, and the younger, the less likely you can fool them. That they will pick up if the language is different, if the tone of voice is different, when the mother speaks to a white person or a black person. For example, I'm just using this as an extreme example. But social biases of infants and young children are malleable, both positive and negative. But by 4 years, these biases become pretty entrenched and resistant to change. So the importance of addressing bias before children reach kindergarten will be key for raising the next generation with less pernicious racial and gender bias than our own. So what can we do to interrupt the transgenerational transmission of trauma and racism? I don't want to simplify this, and I'm sorry I can't see you all so that we can really discuss it, because this is difficult stuff. And to just put it on a slide like I've done just seems to make it so empty and so superficial. So we really need to grapple with it. But it's this reflective capacity, not just mentalizing, but reflective capacity in ourselves and in our children, so that we are the role models of being conscious of ourselves and of the other. And it's only in that way that children can do the same. So it ultimately means taking responsibility for one's actions. It also means not foreclosing. And let me give you an example, a real example that came to me this week. A father of a 9-year-old, the father himself is quite anxious about the COVID pandemic, and has been very conscientious in following the rules, all the rules, and if it says only family together, then he would keep to that, and would do everything on Zoom, etc. So he was very aware. He kept his son at home, and only when everybody went back to school did the child go to school. So very conscientious about the rules. The other part of this father is that he's quite introverted and doesn't quite like crowds. So he quite liked the lockdown. So that's his sort of temperament. So his 9-year-old comes to him and says, no, he's not going to go to his friend's party if there are more than 10 people. So that I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. But he didn't say to him, oh, is that because of Corona? Because that would have foreclosed it. He thought to himself, and this was none of my doing, he just reported it to me in the session, and he thought to himself, I wonder if it has to do with my adhering to the rules, or whether it could be that he is a bit like me and doesn't like big crowds. Let me keep it open. So he went along with it, and he did not pin the child down as to why the child now had 10 and why the child didn't want to stay longer, but helped the child to stay longer, and then talked about Corona and about the easing of the rules in another setting. So he he kept it open. He didn't know what was going on in his child's mind, but he held all the possibilities and respected them, because he said he didn't want to make it into a corona thing if for the child it wasn't. So that's sort of a bit of a longer explanation of an example of real reflective parenting. But we can only be really reflective if we are conscious of our own story, like this father is, and conscious of now I'm talking about collective, our collective situation, conscious of our historical context in which we live. To not avoid the facts, but to think about them and try to imagine what it must have been like and what that means for today's generation. It's the imagination, trying to imagine. And to be truly reflective means to truly take responsibility, collectively and individually. And it is only then that we can help our children in an authentic way. We can't just do this because we decide to do it. It's got to go through our psyches before we can be truly reflective and thereby truly authentic. So an unresolved trauma has a negative impact on the parent-child relationship. And some of you may remember Karen Enzing. She and this person, Bertha Lott, in Canada, did a study on trauma-specific RF, whereby the mother was asked to reflect on just the trauma, not all of her childhood. And they found that that ability buffers the intergenerational transmission of trauma and enabled an organized attachment to develop. It's basically what the Slade study also said. So what does it mean for us collectively? Traumatized persons may, mostly unconsciously, oblige their progeny, those that come off their descendants, to resolve the directly traumatized generation's own unfinished psychological tasks related to the shared trauma. So often it is, and that's certainly the case post-World War II, post-Holocaust, that generation was involved in those traumas could not do the psychological work. They were just about surviving and making a new life for themselves. But it was up to their children to think about it more and to try and resolve it more. And it's interesting what happened in Germany with the Red Army faction, the RAF, how they brought into consciousness in Germany of how many of the Nazi functionaries were in high position in post-war Germany. And they were the ones who upset the whole thing as it needed to be upset and to have to be relooked. But their parents could not do it. It was the students of that time, the 68 revolt. So I'm going to do the last bit. Yeah, I feel ambivalent about because it seems so simplistic. But let me just say again, it's not simple, and it's this person sort of broke it down into various into 5 points. What we can do for our children to interrupt this transmission. But just to remember that underneath that is what have we done with the stories. We can't just do this with our children. So the first thing is children are not colorblind. Talk about it. So when the child says, oh, that child's skin is peach, or that child's skin is black, you say, yes, so it is. So you acknowledge it and talk about it when the child initiates it. You don't start it. When the child asks and initiates. children, and the younger the children are, they are so acutely aware of reality, and they don't have inhibitions in asking and naming the reality, unless somewhere they've been given to understand that this is taboo and they should not. So talk about it and be accurate and age appropriate. So do not be afraid to name different physical characteristics when initiated by the child. So you may have and this is a true story, a 4-year-old who has straight blonde hair, wanted his hair cut very short because he wanted his hair to look like his black friend's curly hair. So he wanted to have hair like Sano. And that's what he wanted. So it wasn't, oh, I want to be black, or I want to, he wanted to have that hair that his little black friend had. And so you go with that. You let it be. They talk about what they see, they don't back away from it. But what is important is that you as the parent or as the adult to a young child, describe the other person by what they are doing and not what they look like. So that is a gardener in the garden. This is a waitress. This is a doctor. Don't say this is a black man. Unless the child says, oh, that person is black, then you say, yes, that person is black, and that person is a waiter. Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't see you all because we have the racial stereotype. We all see color immediately. Certainly my generation, we were brought up with that. So it's ours, but we don't have to just blurt that out to young children, because then they'll get it very quickly and they'll do the same. So try not to preempt things for the young child, but stick with very concrete reality of what that person is doing. There's one story of a little boy who was ordering a cup of baby chino, and he says to his mother, can you ask the white man for another baby chino? She says, what white man? And he saw the waiter had a white clothes apron on, and that for him was the white man. So it was a black man with a white apron. But that's what he saw. So to honor that and to go with that, and not then say to him, oh no, but that's a black man. Yes, the man has a white apron. You're quite right. And take it seriously. Stop and listen what is said about the other person. If something happens at preschool, if something happens at school, to discuss the issue in a specific, open way, which of course is difficult when the children are very young, because, and that's the next point, you can't go into the complexity of things. So it's all very well to say encourage complex thinking, but not really for a 4-year-old. But for a 7-year-old, an 8-year-old, yes. If that child is to ask, why is the child baking outside a child with a brown skin color? For an intelligent 7-year-old, 8-year-old, you should be able to say and give the story of our past. That maybe this child didn't have a chance to go to school. Maybe his parents couldn't look after him because there were times when things were very difficult, etc. So to be open about it, but still digestible for the child. But what's important is the recognition of diverse perspectives. So for this child, that's important. For you, that's important. And when you do the PDI, the Parental Development Interview that measures reflective functioning, one category there is the recognition of diverse perspectives, and that is seen as high reflective functioning. If you can role model for your child that there are different perspectives that for that person may hold as equally as for you, and especially for the older children and for the adolescents, I think you will be helping them a great deal. And the last one, which really puts everything together, is to empower the children, provide children, adolescents in this sphere with anti-stereotype, non-racist models and expose them to diversity. I think many schools are doing that. And this is a picture taken in 1995 in Kailicha. In the case of social attitudes, early childhood experience with other race social partners, combined with positive views of other racial groups, may help to prevent the development of prejudiced attitudes. And I repeat again, we need to reflect personally. We need to focus on our private, wounded selves and not hide behind national trauma at the level of society. By that is we're not saying, oh, there was apartheid, but like I had no part in it. That doesn't help. We've got to put ourselves in it as well, with a personal narrative, to give it words, to share it, to metabolize it. What we then transmit our children will be less toxic, will be reflective, and will be authentic. And this is not reflective on both sides. And this is the danger, that this is what will get transmitted on and on and on, unless we as individuals, and unless the leaders of groups like these on both sides can to really start, reflect, and not use the pain of the past for personal power or political power or whatever. So that, to conclude and just summarize, that historical trauma and racism are deeply embedded in our psyches. And by deeply, I also mean deeply from a neurological point of view. And unless we become aware of this and reflect upon it, we must sort of haul it out of the unconscious, out of the midbrain, and put it in the forebrain. The cycle of prejudice and hate will continue. Thank you.